going to be hearing from Melinda Tuhus, who is a journalist and activist on several fronts, who lives in Connecticut. She has 25 years experience in print and radio, and she works on the radio program Between the Lines and hosts her own program, The Forest and the Tree. She's recently been in New York City covering the summer of heat protests against Citibank. So, welcome, Melinda Tuhus. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm going to raise this up. Can you hear me? I'll just lean over. Can you make it a little higher? I'm just not sure which button to.
Linda, can you announce what stations you're on?
Sure. It's only two. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So I just want to welcome everybody to the Unitarian Society in New Haven, which is my home congregation. It's great to see you all here. Yeah, I report on WSHU and WPKN, and all that stuff is archived. My show, The Forest and the Trees, actually ran this morning. I turned on the radio in the car and I heard myself, and my husband didn't recognize my voice. So. Anyway, but that was a compilation of several interviews I did over the summer of heat. So you can go to The Forest and the Trees, WPKN archives, search for my show, The Forest and the Trees, and you can listen to the half hour. I think it's pretty interesting, personally. So. It's hard to keep going in the face of the growing climate catastrophe. On the other hand, what choice do we have? I spent a lot of time this summer in New York City at the Summer of Heat on Wall Street campaign, where there were 700 arrests, exactly 700 arrests, for nonviolent direct action, mostly targeting Citibank as the biggest investor in new fossil fuel development since the Paris Agreement of 2015. All summer, despite the pleas of frontline communities from the Gulf Coast, and from scientists and parents and people of faith and dancers and folks dressed up as killer whales, CEO Jane Fraser never responded to our multiple requests for a meeting. Citibank claims that it is an environmental leader in the banking sector, but we know otherwise. We also know that the thousands of people who participated over the summer planning and executing some of the most creative actions I've ever been part of, that we have built a powerful community giving us the courage and strength to move ahead. There is actually another big action planned for September 23rd. There was also a lot of action recently at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, D.C., which has rubber-stamped hundreds of permits for fossil projects, especially methane, what we used to call natural gas, and rejected just a handful over the past few decades. Production of both oil and gas is at historic highs in the U.S. Isn't that sad? Dozens of Gulf Coast residents have trekked to D.C. multiple times to meet with FERC commissioners, yet the commissioners regularly approve huge liquefied natural gas, LNG, export terminals that are wrecking the health of frontline residents and killing the climate. These approvals have continued despite the pause the Department of Energy put in place in February, because they need approvals from both FERC and the DOE. A group I'm part of, Beyond Extreme Energy, has creatively disrupted the monthly commissioners' so-called public meetings, where all decisions are made in advance behind closed doors and just announced at the meetings. Next Thursday is the September meeting, and there will be shenanigans happening again. Here in Connecticut, we have had our own fossil fights. After folks living in and near Killingly on the border with Rhode Island opposed a second methane power plant, they are in their small town because they already had one, environmentalists around the state joined the fight. For 2 years, it was all hands on deck, with petitions, rallies, speaking at public hearings, and bird-dogging Governor Lamont and Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Commissioner Katie Dykes until we defeated the proposal. Let me tell you, it was nice to win one. Our state is crisscrossed by methane pipelines, and there's a new effort to stop a major expansion of the so-called Algonquin pipeline. For some reason, energy companies like to steal indigenous names for their dirty projects. Think Iroquois Pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline, and more. Maybe they learned that doing so just pisses people off to fight them harder, because now Enbridge, a Canadian behemoth that is behind many other terrible and hard-fought projects, is proposing to call the expansion Project Maple. It sounds so quintessentially New England. It would go from the New Jersey-New York border through Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and we have built a 4-state coalition to stop it. This is one of the C3M. What is our Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization? It's so many words, but we just say C3M. It's one of our priorities. The other main effort we are engaged in is working to get an environmental rights amendment to our state constitution passed. It would guarantee Connecticut residents the right to clean air, pure water, healthy soil, and a safe climate. Right now, there is not a word in our state constitution about environmental protection. Such an amendment would give an extra layer of protection to our climate and environmental laws. And we have some people in the back, and I have more information, and I brought, Rob, can you go in my bag and pick out the yellow sticker? I'm supposed to bring this out. Okay. We have bumper stickers. And everybody is invited and requested and urged to take one or more. It's hard to keep going in the face of the growing climate catastrophe. The climate-fueled disasters that are happening more and more in the U.S., wildfires, droughts, floods, hurricanes, sea level rise, are taking an even greater toll on the countries of the global south, which have made the least contribution to the problem. We can't just build out clean energy sources. We have to stop digging the hole of greenhouse gas emissions deeper. Find me after Brian's talk. I don't think it'll be too hard to find me. Which I'm really looking forward to hearing. If you want to learn more about any of these efforts or pick up any swag from me or the folks on the table back there. Thank you for your time and attention.
Yeah, I'm inconveniently short, so it's going to be a lot of up and down with this mic today. Thank you, Melinda. One second. So the Shafer Lecture gets its name from Mark Shafer. Mark Shafer was a peace activist who took part in promoting enduring peace for over 20 years. And his focus was on making nuclear war less likely by helping to give the so-called enemy a human face, which I think is something that we really need to focus our energies on again today. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce Brian Tokar. Brian Tokar is an activist and author. He's written 12 books. He taught at the University of Vermont in the environmental program and is a longtime faculty and board member of the Institute for Social Ecology, based in Plainfield, Vermont. And I also want to add that I have the great honor of being Brian's mentee in the Institute for Social Ecology mentorship program, which is to help new activists, organizers, theorists, etc., to really develop their vision and their work for building the new social ecological utopia. So on that note, I welcome Brian to come and share his wisdom with you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, everybody, especially Stan, who's been managing all the logistics around getting me here and getting the publicity out. And we did a terrific interview on the screen a few days ago, and set up the interview with WPKN just a few days ago as well. And thanks, everybody, for coming out on a gorgeous Saturday afternoon to hear about the climate crisis and what we can do about it. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the basic climate situation that we're in the midst of, kind of get us all on the same page in terms of the science and politics of global climate disruption, and then hopefully fairly quickly shift into talking about what we do about it in terms of renewable energy, in terms of the evolution of a climate justice movement, which has been developing around the world over many years. And then we'll dive headfirst into this central question of where we're headed. And of course, on the left, you see a classic, I'm going to just handhold this. You see a classic image from California, which has been in flames for many years, almost year-round. And then on the right, a graphic from an organization I learned about at an event in New York City a couple of years ago called Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, that had a very high profile during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think is one of the many examples we can draw on for the kind of organization that points toward a more forward-looking outlook on how our communities can both prepare, fend off the worst consequences, and hopefully eventually really get to a better place in the face of this crisis. So these are the kinds of images that unfortunately we find on our screens on an increasingly frequent basis today. Of course, the immediate consequences on the ground of the wildfires in California, along with devastating droughts that have affected many of the most important agricultural areas in this country. And around the world, we see images of devastating floods. This is Houston just a few years ago. And then, for many of us, most surprisingly, Montpelier, Vermont, just a little over a year ago. A couple of years ago, a study came out saying that the county we live in, around Montpelier, along with most of northern Vermont, was in the list of the most climate-resilient counties in the entire United States. Yet, twice in the last 2 years, we've had devastating floods. Montpelier was underwater for several days. A lot of those shops downtown have still not reopened. Montpelier is the state capital, still doesn't have a functioning post office because the federal building there got so severely flooded. And then just again this July, for the second year in a row, on literally the same day, we had a huge downfall of rain, and many of our back roads especially got severely washed out and are still in the process of being fixed. We see more and more of these kinds of images. And in 2023, which we'll see in a minute, was by far the hottest year on record. There was one of these major climate-related weather disasters literally more than every 2 weeks, 28 over the course of the year. And this is a map showing what was experienced in various parts of the US during the course of last year. And of course, this doesn't include some of the most extreme heat waves that didn't necessarily have a significant monetary cost, but were equally devastating for the lives of the people who were experiencing them. And of course, the events that we mostly read about are the ones close to home. But as we know from the core message of climate justice that Melissa mentioned, and more on that in a minute, for every event that we read about here in the US, there are things happening in other parts of the world that are mostly not in the news. And this is a a graphic from The Guardian from just a couple of years ago. We all know about what's been happening in California, but we rarely hear about the equally or more devastating wildfires in places like Indonesia, in Australia, in Morocco. We hear about the floods in places like France and the US Midwest and the Gulf Coast, but we don't hear about equally or more devastating floods in the Middle East, and especially all across South Asia, where major cities have found themselves underwater time after time after time over the last several years. And this is, as we heard a bit ago, the core message of climate justice. That those people in the world who contribute the least to excess emissions of carbon dioxide and all of the other greenhouse gases not only will be, but have for many decades been overwhelmingly the most impacted by the consequences. And this is from a study from McGill University about a dozen years ago. This is the profile of per capita emissions of carbon dioxide. The map on the bottom represents synthesis of a number of demographic variables that these researchers pointed to as indications of climate vulnerability. And there's, of course, an almost completely inverse relationship between the places that are the highest emitters and the places that are the most climate vulnerable. The most conspicuous exception, not surprisingly, is right here in Saudi Arabia, major source of oil production for the world, as well as a highly vulnerable area. And as I mentioned, places in the global south have been dealing with the immediate consequences of this crisis much longer than we have. And now it's possible, using historical satellite data, to go back and extrapolate when people in various regions of the world first began to experience noticeable systematic increases in temperature and the various disruptive weather events that we know go along with that. So in places in the Amazon and the Caribbean, in East Africa and Southeast Asia, these phenomena go back all the way to the 1970s, when here in the US, many of us were concerned that the climate crisis might be imminent and that within many decades we would be experiencing those consequences. In those parts of the world, people already were. In much of the global south, the effects were already noticeable by the 1980s. And then, of course, more recently, as you go north. And, of course, every time a major weather disaster happens, we hear in the media, we don't really know if it's climate related. It's so difficult for scientists to really determine the climate impacts on our weather. But there's a systematic science of climate attribution that's now been developing for a dozen years, that's increasingly more sophisticated. This is one of the very first studies, it's the first one I'm aware of, that was published in the journal Nature back in 2011. They looked at a series of flooding events in England and Wales back in 2000. It took them 10 years to do the calculations. They had to literally draw on a network of people loaning time on their computers all around the world to generate the data to determine that it was extremely unlikely that this would have happened if you don't take into account the consequences of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. Now, a dozen years later, this science of climate attribution is much more precise, much more reliable. Within a couple of weeks of a major weather event, the scientists are telling us how unlikely this would have been if it weren't for the direct effects of climate disruption. And this is the temperature profile. Just going back to the 1940s, and things were relatively stable for decades, just a little bit above normal. And then in the 1980s, as many of us who have been around for a while remember, the effects of climate change began to be noticeable and began to accelerate to the point where 2023 was, by quite a large margin, the hottest year since records began. And the stable climate that predates the current situation goes back very far. This is an 800,000-year profile of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And of course, scientists have gotten better and better at using indirect measurements like ice core samples and ocean core measurements and tree rings and what have you to extrapolate back the climate conditions and the carbon dioxide concentrations going back literally millions of years. And the fluctuations, the steady fluctuations, are the ice ages that we all know about. But you'd have to go back at least 2 million years, way off the left end of this graph, to get to an atmospheric carbon dioxide level at all comparable to what we're experiencing right now. And along with this, we see this accelerating trend of climate-related weather disasters. This is from the UK Met Office, which is the British equivalent of the National Weather Service. They've been documenting this history along with the major international reinsurance companies, the people who insure the insurers. And you know, for routine geophysical events that aren't climate-related, like earthquakes and volcanoes, that's the bright red, and that's pretty steady. But we've seen a steady acceleration of meteorological events, hydrological events like major floods, and specifically climatological events like extreme temperatures. I'll point out that this only goes to 2020 and doesn't include the effects of the tremendous acceleration of climate consequences that we've experienced just over the last 3 or 4 years. This is just to remind you, very briefly, that the climate crisis isn't the only serious predicament we find ourselves in. Scientists have honed in on what are now viewed as 9 primary planetary boundaries that are in danger of being breached. And climate change is one of them, starting to get, as of this graph this chart in 2015, into the yellow zone. It's probably a little into the orange by now. But all of these others, some of which are climate related, some of which aren't, are other stressors that we're really up against in a systematic way. Novel entities is mostly toxic chemicals, ozone depletion we know about, atmospheric aerosol loading, just the amount of dust and soot in the atmosphere, ocean acidification, which is of course directly related to carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and other things, biogeochemical flows, basically the global nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, which are already very much in the red zone, loss of fresh water, changes to land systems like deforestation, the fires that are now sweeping the Amazon as a result of deforestation there, and the loss of biodiversity. We know we're in the midst of a major extinction crisis that scientists compare to the global scale extinctions that we associate with the dying off of the dinosaurs millions and millions of years ago. So these are all interacting qualities, but they're measurements of each one that give us a sense of where we are and where we might be headed, and also what we need to work to avoid. Just a very brief summary on who's responsible for these emissions. This is divided by economic sectors, and the breakdown hasn't changed very much since way back in the 1990s. About a third of the excess Carbon dioxide emissions are from our energy systems, electricity production, oil refining, etc. And the remaining 2/3 is almost equally divided in 3 groups, one being industry, one being what on this chart is called AFOLU, which is short for agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So everything attributable to deforestation, to the consequences of industrial scale agriculture is in blue, and the remaining portion from a combination of transportation and buildings. Since a lot of folks here are involved in the peace movement, I wanted to include this chart, which shows the carbon footprint of the top 60 countries in the world. The US military is number 54. So if the US military were a country unto itself, its emissions would be well in the top third of the 200-odd countries around the world, and very close to being in the top quarter. All the Scandinavian countries, for example, including Norway, which is a major oil producer, are below the emissions of the US military. In the UN conversations about responsibility for climate-damaging emissions, the discussion is almost entirely focused on how responsibility is divided among countries. But research from Thomas Piketty's research group in France and others have shown that an equal share of responsibility for emissions can only be explained by looking at inequalities within those countries. So on a global scale, and this is a chart from Oxfam, which has been documenting this in really clear and graphic ways for many years, and this is also getting a little old, this is from 2020, the richest 1% of people around the world, and that's whether they're here in the US or part of the tiny high-consuming elites in countries like India and China and Russia and Mexico and Brazil and all the others. The richest 1% of people in the world are responsible for 15% of emissions of greenhouse gases. The richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for more than half. And the poorest half of the world's population are only responsible for 7% of emissions. So the climate crisis is a social justice issue, it's a class issue, it's an issue that really forces us to ask important questions about the maldistribution of wealth around the world and what we need to do about that. A little bit of more positive news has to do with the increasingly rapid deployment of renewable energy. This shows that over the last 20 years, we've begun to get to the point where almost 1/3 of the electricity generated in the world is now from renewable energy. The proportion from hydroelectric power, mostly huge scale dams, is actually decreasing, and that's because of climate-related droughts affecting the capacity of the world's major hydroelectric dams. But the rapid rise of wind and solar energy meeting an increasing share of our needs. And there are countries in the world, especially in Europe, that are getting now close to, sometimes more than 50% of their energy from renewables. Of course, the electricity sector is the one that is going renewable the fastest. And we're way behind in terms of how we heat our homes and especially vehicles. Even though there are more electric vehicles being made, it's not yet really solving the problem of transportation emissions. We also know that the relative cost of renewable energy has been falling rapidly over the last couple of decades. This is again going back to 2009. The price of coal has stayed about the same, and levelized cost means life cycle cost. So for something like a solar energy facility, most of the cost is in construction. In the case of coal, a lot of the cost is from the extraction of coal, but also the cost of maintaining power plants and continuing to operate them. And the cost of, certainly the cost to utilities of buying the fuel, equally true of gas. The price of gas has gone down a little bit. The price of nuclear energy has spiked substantially, and the major spike here is from all the added safety measures that proved necessary after the Fukushima disaster in 2011. And the cost of nuclear, which is falsely promoted as a climate solution, is continuing to rise. Meanwhile, wind energy, the cost has fallen quite rapidly, and the cost of solar energy has fallen very rapidly over the last 10 years or so. And that's good news. But it's not enough, because we live in an economic system where the cost and efficiency of things isn't necessarily what determines whether things happen or not. We live in a system that is based on profit, as you all know. And under capitalism, what's most profitable rules, and fossil fuel production and extraction and use continues to be one of the most profitable industries in the world. And we know from a book that just came out earlier this year that because renewable energy is so much more dependent on capital markets than fossil fuels, because of course the oil and gas and coal companies make most of their capital that they're able to reinvest in continuing production from the sale of those fossil fuels. Renewable energy is much more dependent on capital markets, and therefore its profitability is structurally constrained to be less robust than the profitability of fossil fuels. That's something that people often forget. Some of you may remember people like Amory Lovins, who was one of the first people to really do these kinds of calculations, but then sometime around 2000 started to come around and say, well, because renewable energy is inherently going to become much cheaper over time, we don't have to worry that much about public policy. The market will usher in a renewable future for us. But because of the structures of capitalism, that unfortunately is not the case. And this book argues that it's highly likely that because of that, renewable energy will continue to depend significantly on public subsidies. We also know that renewable energy is very dependent on mining for minerals, massive increase in the amount of mining that's projected by the International Energy Agency as we begin to transition to renewable energy. And we know that even though there's a lot of debate about whether the decrease in mining and other forms of destruction of the earth from the elimination of, for example, coal extraction might outweigh the increased mining for renewable energy. We know that most of the new mines that are proposed are on or close to land held and lived on by indigenous people, and it's the indigenous people around the world that are really in the forefront of opposition to this potential new wave of mining. We know that there are also new technologies for batteries that rely on more commonly available materials like sodium and iron instead of lithium and cobalt, and there's progress in that direction, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're still dependent on mining, for example, of lithium to support the batteries in the electric vehicles that currently exist. So there's hope in the technological sphere, but there's often a downside. And we need to be aware of that as we look at some of these longer-term trends. As I mentioned in my radio interview the other day, I've long believed and continue to believe that the real hope lies with our social movements. And I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the evolution of climate justice as a set of movements around the world.